So if the panelists or the chatters for the Fireside Chat would like to make their way to these slightly less comfortable than I anticipated chairs, go ahead. And so I'd also like to introduce Niki Werkheiser, who is the Director for Technology Maturation in Space Technology Mission Directorate and is an amazing, amazing sponsor. Oh, yep.
I forgot.
That's okay.
Thank you.
All right, so they're going to start off with some questions, but then we'll read some off from Slido. And as Jim said, if you're writing in ones that you would like the broader governmental panel to address tomorrow, please tag them, put some kind of little note, and then we'll save those for tomorrow. We need to have those all together so we can kind of condense them and make sure that we can get through as many as possible when we've got everybody here. So I will pass it off to you, Niki. You good?
Okay. Testing. Okay, works. Hello, everyone. So now is the fun part of the program, the more fun. All of it's been fun, right? But now we get to ask questions. So what I'm going to do is ask Spuds a question and Jim a question while everyone submits questions from the audience. And then I'll look over to Jody when we have those in Slido and have her to read those out. So Spuds, we'll start with you. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes in the world in a lot of ways since the Apollo program, including significant technology advancements, obviously. What are the differences, would you say, between our return to the moon, the biggest differences that you would note, how technology advancements might help that, et cetera?
So, well, first off, and I've heard Kathy say this, I'm going to steal her line. You know, the moon didn't change, we did. You know, the difference between the 1960s and now is a big chunk of technology, but also go all the way back to that first slide in my deck with the why, right? There was a different why back then. I would submit to you it was more that lower right-hand side, the national posture, national security, that was what it was all about. And science was a sideshow. And there wasn't thought about sticking around. That's why the program kind of came and went, is because we accomplished what we proved that we could do it, and then that was the end, right? It's different now. And I didn't have a slide on, there's one in the backups. You'll see it in the document if you scan the QR code about the scope of what we're doing. Anytime, you know, history is replete with when humans go to explore the next domain, whether it was land to the sea or air to space, just in Leo, and then we do the same pattern, right? It's always the same thing. It's always we go, we learn to survive there. Can we get there? We get there. Can we survive there? But then eventually we thrive. We live. We execute from there, and then we plan for the next step. And we have eyes set. And within this community, our human spaceflight community, there's usually these arguments between it's go to the moon and forget about Mars. Mars is so far out, you can't do it. And there's other folks, the other camp, who says, do the minimum or don't even think about the moon, let's just get on to Mars. And so that's what I'm saying. It's human nature. We're doing both. And that's what the scope of this whole thing is. It settles that argument. It's not one or the other. It's both. We're going to stay. It's sustained. We're going to a different place on the moon. We're not going to the equatorial belt. We're going where where the really interesting stuff is and the resources that we need to get to. So where we're going, how long we're staying has changed, and all the technology that's happened between, you know, from the Apollo era to now is all feeding into that. And I would also put in a commercial too about all of this. I'm sitting there looking at your last slide, Jim, and like that is the tank in the in the systems engineering slide of mine that has the tank of the space technologies. There's a spectrum in there, the low TRL all the way up to the high TRL, and the lower end of these seed corn is being planted, and all of those yellow numbers on there represent seeds that are being planted that are going to be needed. If we don't plant those things now, we don't have a crop. We don't have technology to go execute on later. And so in the 1960s, we had an objective, and we did it, we checked the box. We are talking about sustained presence now, which means we have to start. If we're not thinking about it now, the folks out here in this group are starting to apply to, plant those seeds to get us to a point so that 15 years from now, the things that we're not in our objectives now we're ready for the next wave of objectives that are going to come when we look at this again.
Thank you. That was very well put, and I would say that summed up too the reason that we started this consortium and how the 6 capability areas that are defined for that needed infrastructure on the way to sustainability were articulated and developed. So I'm so happy to see this audience grow. So Jim, question for you. So how does NASA Space Tech in developing the technology development goals and objectives also help to catalyze and grow economic growth?
Yeah, thank you, Niki. What I would say is, and refer back first of all to that 3 primary objectives chart that I showed right at the beginning. One of the top things we do, one of those is to help enable the U.S. space economy as we go through this. And so especially as we look towards shifting towards the higher TRL activities, a large part of those, what we're trying to do is have partnerships that help bring us along. And those partnerships being representing other agencies, other industries, universities, or whatever. And so and then our solicitations as we go through, we're really keenly focused on what can we do to help, providing both funding and opportunities that would really help enable that NASA is no longer is the only customer, and actually it is already not the only customer. There's actually an impressive amount that the CLPS landers are getting into with other opportunities for funding. And so, but making sure that we help that pipeline as we go through this. And so it's a core to what we're trying to pursue.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just remind everyone, too, that a lot of that will be discussed in Wednesday's funding workshop. For those that are able to stay and participate in that, we'll have our amazing Space Tech program executives here talking about all the different opportunities and ways to get involved or take advantage of solicitations, et cetera. Okay, so Jody, do we have some questions on Slido? Do you want to share one?
Hello. Hi. Our first question, and this is for Spuds. How are the Moon to Mars objectives prioritized with respect to other NASA priorities, i.e. ISS, outer solar system science, etc.?
That is an excellent question. I will actually go so far, before we even get into that, go from the top down. So I jokingly say if there's a mason jar that you had of all NASA priorities, Moon to Mars is a very large rock in that, and you're trying to, shove rocks in there. Moon to Mars is a very big rock in there. When you unpack and say, okay, well, how does that play with all the other priorities? This coming year, one of the things that we're taking on in the Federated Board is looking at mapping. Now that we've got the objectives established, and Jim Free and his organization is working on building out, and doing this evolutionary architecture development process on deconstructing from right to left. What we're now doing is we're working on the mapping of those objectives to the whys, to the things that people care about. And while we're doing that on the Federated Board, and Jim is mapping back from the objectives back into the architecture, we'll now have a forensic path that takes us from anything going on at any level, you can deconstruct this any level you want, all the way to why somebody cares, right? Can you imagine the utility of that? I've applied this in a past life, multiple portfolios that I've run, and it works really well for managing the folks that want to kind of get in and start messing with the rigor of your system and whatnot. It really does serve us well. What that also does is it also gives you a natural, you don't have to be married to the numbers, but it gives you a prioritization of things so that when you have the limited funding and you got to distribute that funding across that wireframe, it allows you to put some priorities, because there's tyranny of the urgent in some cases, and there's just prioritization purely from the importance or how much it hits those areas that people care about. So the specific answer to that question is, give us some time. We need to work through that this year to kind of actually how to specifically answer that question. Generally speaking, though, it's going to play. You're going to be able to see that prioritization kind of play out within the objectives, as well as I think from a leadership standpoint. Ask Pam that same question tomorrow. Let's see what she says. But I would think it's going to be a very useful tool for them to help prioritize across other NASA priorities as well, like an ARMD and whatnot.
And I'll just add to it, because it's probably one of the biggest struggles I have as an associate administrator is we have a lot of different customers that we're trying to support. Moon to Mars is very high on that list of importance and stuff, but it's far from the only one. There's a lot of science objectives that are outside of the moon to Mars that we try to look for technologies that can benefit that, as well as more broadly in the space economy as we go through that, and really across the board. So it's one of the biggest things we struggle with, and so that's part of the reason we have principal technologists and system capability leads as we go through this, and a chief architect. We go through a process where we hear everyone out. And the objectives that they have, whether it's for ISS or for Moon to Mars or science or outside NASA, as we go through this, and then it becomes a discussion among us of what are the things that we think are the highest value across this. And to a large extent, it's a judgment call in the end of the things, but you find ways to try to seek balance as you're going through it. So, but it's very much probably one of the most challenging things we have with the funding limitations that we have.
Yeah, and one last thing on that, I'd be remiss if I didn't make a note just from the perspective of executing these programs and projects and working directly with all of our different customers and stakeholders. We come to forums like this. Right now we're talking Artemis, we're talking lunar surface, and so we're going to put everything in the context and applications of that. So depending on the audience, we talk different things, but I want to remind everyone there's so many cross-cutting technologies that apply to all these areas. You take things like autonomy and robotics, that's a keep me up at night kind of thing for the lunar surface, but of course that applies to any mission. Same thing for our advanced manufacturing and our additive manufacturing capabilities. Propulsion, all of these areas that have very cross-cutting applications, our high-performance spaceflight computing activity. So even though we talk those things in here in the context of the lunar surface, I do want to point out that many of them have various multiple customers.
Yeah, cross-cutting and transformative are two key things we look for.
And I know we don't want to stay on just one question, but I do have one other thought that I'd just like to share, because it's important to this community. I come from DARPA, and I did a lot of technology development in my past. That's what and if you use DARPA as an example, which has an 80% mortality rate on its projects, I have said this since I got here. I think space tech, in particular at NASA, is massively underfunded. I've been saying, I keep saying that. There needs to be more investment in this area. And the reason why people, maybe sometimes they get shied away, and we got to draw attention to it, is that because you're planting, you're at the beginning, you're at the conceptual phase on some of these things, and people don't see it, and they're very worried about the here and now. If you don't, we have to keep that drumbeat and keep people focused on the fact that there has to be a balanced portfolio, and space tech is one end of that teeter-totter. It's got to be funded well so that you can balance this whole thing out for your future.
All right, our next question is for Jim. How are the Moon to Mars objectives informing STMD award decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So a large part of, when we make awards, first of all, it starts with topics. We select topics that we want to have to hear proposals from. Those topics are heavily informed. When we decide, a large part of our portfolio is to do Moon to Mars. And those topics are heavily informed by where do we see the strategic gaps are that's part of the Moon to Mars objectives, as well as other places. And so then we go through the process of selecting those things, and then it's a value judgment, and as we're evaluating these proposals. But a key part of that is how well are they, how much value are we getting for those, and achieving or mitigating at least one or more of the strategic gaps that we have as part of our objectives. So it really kind of, it's kind of core to, as we go through this, every step of the way, to look at what can we do here for the portion of our funding that devotes to Moon to Mars, then we look at what are how can we create the most value.
All right, our next question is for Spuds. What are the plans for international collaboration?
Well, that's a big one, isn't it? Put it this way: that is that's a federated board topic about how we're doing that and how it blends not just for Moon to Mars with how each of the other mission directorates have their interaction. So that's a very generic. Can't answer that question in a lot of detail. I will say big picture though. It started with the campaign last year and getting feedback from our international partners on the objectives, culminating in the workshop last July in London. And we made a promise. It was actually one of the questions that came, one of the comments that came back, the forms of feedback is, don't make this a one and done. Don't just ask us now and then go away back into the NASA hole and hide and do your thing. And we made a promise then that was not our intent, and that there would be a continual engagement process. So I cannot speak the specifics. I do know that at the Space Symposium last week, part of what Pam mentioned, if you caught her briefing, and it may, I don't know if it'll be in what she says tomorrow, but there are multiple ways for our partners to engage, including the international partners. One of them is going to be another series of workshops for both industry and international partners this summer. We don't have the specific dates yet, but that is going to be a continual cadence that matches the yearly cycle of the architecture concept review. So details to follow, that's being worked out as we speak, but there's a very high intent there to continue that process from last year.
This question is for Jim and Spuds. How do Moon to Mars and STMD funding and priorities interact with Artemis?
Yeah, that's very much like the first question. And if Jim Free were sitting here, he'd probably be doing the same thing, begging patience and just saying, look, this is going to work itself out. The reason, and I am stealing a little bit of Pam's thunder, so I'll just give you the big picture and then let her speak to it tomorrow. But they have broken up, instead of trying to bite off this entire thing in one shot in 1 year and then come up with that answer where there would be some holes in it, they've broken it up into segments. And the first segment is human lunar return, because that's the thing that's right in front of us. That's Artemis 2 through 5. There are other segments in this process. So the answer to that question depends on when you ask. We're not doing this in one shot. We're doing this in phases. And the ones that are going to hit us more quickly, obviously those are Artemis 2 through 5. So the correlation is going to be very close for the products that you see coming out in the architecture development description, I think is what it's called, ADD. You're going to see that correlation very tight with Artemis. It's then, as you start to bake in the science and the pieces on Mars and whatnot, a lot of infrastructure things that are forward-looking, that's going to get a little bit, I think you're going to see that play out. Some is going to be soon in, but some it's going to be further out. So it's general.
And I'll just add to that, from a space tech standpoint, we're a fundamental part of the Federated Board. As these discussions goes on, then we're a key input to that, and throughout the whole budgeting process. And for us, space tech is the people, we're the ones that need to look forward. We need to be working on the things here that are going to be needed 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Because complex technology takes a long time to develop. Many of the things we do take 20 years as we go through this. So a big part of what we need to do is show that forward need and in today's environment that's going through it.
And I know I'm not supposed to, but I'm going to add to that. So first of all, this is a good opportunity. At every one of these meetings, we try to, and they'll probably get mad at me later, but I want to introduce a few people in the audiences, so if you can stand up. First, I want to say our Space Tech Chief Architect is here, and I want to introduce her, Michelle Monk, because these are the folks that, there she is. So attack at lunch, you can go talk to Michelle. She is the sole person responsible for working across all these, no, I'm kidding, but she is a lot of it, to work across the programs with the stakeholders, do the top-down, bottom-up on what those priorities and phasing are. And then if our principal technologist and our system capability leads can please stand up. I always like to point them out before the lunch break. Jerry Sanders for ISRU over here. Who all we got? You shout out your name. We got John Vickers for advanced manufacturing. Go ahead. Wes Powell's here for avionics. I just went blank. Avionics. I was about to say autonomy. It starts with an A. Go ahead. Excavation and construction. Anybody else here? I know we have folks online as well. And I just wanted to say, too, when Jim talks about the next 5, 10, 20 years, a lot of that, there's a lot of work being done all along the way, though. So you take something like our power systems. We have vertical solar array technologies that we're developing now with 3 companies building ground prototypes. We hope to do a flight demo in the mid to late 2020s on that technology. So there's a lot happening in that time frame that does require funding. So that's one of the key messages that we have to really get across.
Okay. I know we would like to talk forever, but I think we're about 5 minutes over from our schedule, so I'd like to thank the speakers again. All right, so we're going to take a 15-minute break rather than 20, sorry. And then we're going to come back in here, talk a little bit more about some of the work that's been going on in LSII and LSIC, and then you're going to have a nice long break at lunchtime to talk to people a little bit more about some of your questions. But I do also encourage you to submit questions into Slido that we can talk about more tomorrow during the keynote panel, where we'll come back to the same themes. And we may roll some of the questions over that came in for this panel so that we can address them when everyone's here. So finally, if you are sending in questions for that, please tag them. Just say for tomorrow or something like that. And we'll accept those through the end of lunch, at what point we want to try to merge some of those questions together and get the speakers prepped for that. All right, thanks very much.